Hello everyone. In today's video, we're going to be continuing our little private pilot series by looking at a little bit of manual instrument work. So one of the requirements for being a visual flight, regular old private pilot is you have to have a little bit of experience with flying in instrument conditions. Now, usually what we do in the real world, of course, is we do simulated instrument conditions, which involves wearing this really funny looking hat that prevents you from looking out the front window. Of course, you just tip your head like this and you go, ah, and you can see out the window all right. And obviously, if you're in an ultramodern airplane that has all sorts of, fun toys on it and like digital displays, this is not that challenging. But unfortunately for us, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking ourselves a very short flight from this Ellington Airport over to Hartford Airport. Not exactly a long distance, but we're going to do it completely using our instrument skills. We have created the weather here, so it's a little bit nasty outside to kind of simulate this. And now once we do get up into the clouds, we'll start talking about kind of what you need to be thinking about when you're doing manual instrument work. Now, several of you, of course, are going to say, why don't you go ahead and utilize the automatic pilot? I completely agree with you. The autopilot is your best friend in an instrument condition. But today we're going to get a little old school. So let's go ahead and release my parking brake here. I'm going to apply full power, and we're going to get this row in a show, kind of a thing like that. Now, I've chosen to use the traditional Cessna 172 here. I did not opt to use the G1000 Cessna, only on account of the fact that the G1000 Cessna's got a little bit too many bells and whistles on it, so we don't need all of that. Now, we got ourselves a really nice crosswind today, which you can see is knocking me all around the runway. Give this thing a nice gentle tug, and we are on our way. Now, because this runway is so incredibly short, I'm not going to be wrapping those flaps up as quickly as I usually do. But I am going to give myself a little bit of altitude. I swear this thing just underpowered. All right, let's go bring that notch of flaps up so we can start accelerating. Again, you don't want to pull back too much. You're going to get yourself pretty much into departure stall before the flight's even started. Now, the nasty thing about this particular airport in the real world is you're in a valley here, so you have to be very cautious about basically overflying the plane. Okay, let's go ahead and get this thing going. I'm going to give myself a good handful of trim here and start aiming towards that big nasty cloud. All right. So first things first, I want to make sure that I can see everything. This is kind of an interesting little problem, so I'm actually going to go ahead and turn my lights on just a little bit, which makes it a little bit easier. Again, everybody's got kind of a different perspective. I'm a fan of lighting up the instruments. Some people are a fan of lighting up the individual pieces there. Again, it's whatever works for you. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure I can see everything pretty smoothly. I'm going to go ahead and do my initial turn towards where I'm going to be flying to. Now, unfortunately, those clouds don't look nearly nasty enough. So let's grab the clouds, crank up the coverage. Much better. Okay, now we're in instrument conditions. Who needs simulated conditions when you have actual conditions? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue climbing. Again, trim is your best friend here. So get your hand on the trim control and don't be afraid to manipulate it a lot. Let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit and start thinking about our instrument stuff. So when we're flying in instrument conditions, there's a couple different things you want to be thinking about. Again, this is doing manual conditions here. This is not using an automatic pilot or anything like that. You have your airspeed, you have your attitude indicator, you've got your altitude, altimeter, you have your turn coordinator, you have your directional gyro, and of course you have your very sticky instrument, the vertical speed indicator. Now, when you're usually flying in some kind of instrument manual conditions, you always want to be considering about the relationship between all these instruments. You notice when my vertical speed starts to go down, then my rate of climb starts to drop down, then my speed starts to shift. You'll notice when the aircraft turns, your turn coordinator is going to start doing something. You're going to notice your directional gyro is going to start shifting. So what you're going to be doing when you're entering into manual instrument conditions is you're basically going to be developing what they call a scan. What a scan is simply the pattern you follow with your eyes to make sure everything checks out at all times. Generally, you never want to fixate on one instrument. I know it's very tempting to stare right into this instrument, basically get stuck in this instrument, but the reality is you need to be constantly checking. The usual maneuver that I recommend people doing is what I call the V. Let's go ahead and pause this aircraft for just a second once it gets my 2,000 feet. That looks pretty good. So the V simply means we use this as our base instrument. We quickly glare at this instrument, check to make sure this agrees, come back to our base instrument again, take a look at my next instrument, again this would be my vertical speed, then come back. Then we'll check our airspeed, come back. We'll come check our altimeter, come back, and then of course we'll check our directional gyro. So basically what you're doing is you're making this kind of V shape as you're going back and forth. Another technique people will use is I call it the box, where basically start here, looks good, looks good, looks good, looks good, looks good, looks good. And again, this becomes a pattern that you never stop manipulating. Now the thing you're going to have to get out of your system, and again, this is difficult for me, is not getting stuck. And again, what you're going to want to do is you're going to look at this, you're going to say, I need to take a turn now. So you're going to start focusing on this for the turn. But by doing so, you're going to lose sight of everything else that you have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'll keep my zoom in a little bit so you can kind of concentrate on the controls. So I'm going to go ahead and level off. So I'm going to go ahead and push the nose down. So now I'm going to hold myself right there. I'm going to go ahead and set my power. Okay, so here's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to look at the middle instrument. Now quickly go up to the top right. Is the altitude where it wants to be? Good. Come to the center. Does that look good? Okay, that's the correct direction we travel in. Bottom right. Oh, my vertical speed keeps coming up. So I'm going to gently apply a correction and then keep scanning as I hold that correction in. Now this is a little trickier compared to the real plane, is in the real plane you can trim by sense. You don't have to trim by basically feel here. Now one of the things that makes this a good aircraft to track this in is because it's tremendously sensitive. And unfortunately the trim in Flight Simulator leaves a lot to be desired as far as stability goes. Alright, so my altitude is set correctly. We're getting a little bit closer. Direction looks pretty good. We actually need to execute a turn. So now that I've got everything configured, I'm actually going to hold my nose up just a little bit and pause one more time. I'll show you a really slick trick. Does everybody see this little tiny needle here? This actually lets you calibrate this line. So can you see how this line shows that it's slightly below the horizon and it's giving me vertical speed of 0? I can actually take this and manually adjust it so that it matches what actually gives you a 0 climb condition. And you can see I've actually had to wiggle that a little teeny tiny bit. Yeah, let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit of that. Go ahead and pause again. So now I can look very quickly at my attitude indicator to determine what my attitude is rather than having to focus on the other instruments. This is pretty much universal in almost every aircraft. All right, so I'm going pretty well here. Now we're going to go ahead and execute a turn. So again, don't get fixated on any instrument. Take a look at my attitude indicator. Looks good. Airspeed looks good. Looks directional gyro looks good. Vertical speed. You can see I'm having a little bit of difficulty trimming this thing out. Nothing new there. So check out my turn coordinator. I'm turning gently to the left. So let's go ahead and turn this aircraft now. We're going to come to a heading of 210. So I'm going to begin by looking at my attitude indicator. I'm going to establish my correct angle of bank. I'm going to take a look at my vertical speed indicator. Down I go look at my directional gyro, go back up to my altimeter, go take a look at my turn coordinator, make sure that's at a constant rate. Take a look at my airspeed indicator. You can see the aircraft has a tendency to want to climb. Again, constantly be going back and forth through all the instruments and do very, very gentle corrections. Go ahead and cancel it out. Again, constantly be checking between your different instruments. This aircraft just says wants to climb. Again, we're trying to bring ourselves a little bit closer to that course that we were on originally. So I'm taking a look again at the center. We're getting a little bit of dive again. Altimeter looks good. Direction looks good. You can see that vertical speed is all over the place. Again, make a quick correction and check everything out, and then see if the correction did what you needed it to do. If it didn't, then we can go back and make a greater correction. Again, constantly be alternating. Go ahead and pull that up just a teeny tiny bit. You can see this is extremely sensitive, which is not uncommon. In the real plane, it can actually be worse. All right, looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. Again, this is why you need nice and sensitive controls that aren't too aggressive. All right, looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. Everything looks good. Now it's a good time to go ahead and think about descending and ascending. So let me go ahead and pause again real quickly here. So let's say we want to make this aircraft go upwards. Now that we got the trim set, our direction looks pretty good. Again, we're flying parallel here. I know I said 210, but again, we want it to become a little closer to this. Now what we want to be doing is we want to think about ascending and descending. This is where people get themselves in a lot of trouble. The safest way to ascend is don't touch your trim. Instead, just apply full power. Safest way to descend is to reduce your power and not touch your trim. Use your power to control your climb rate as opposed to the pitch. The moment you start pitching and trimming, you've ruined all this hard work that you've done right here. So I'm going to go ahead and unpause again here. Go ahead and have to feel the controls out. Remember, we can't see anything out the front window. There's no autopilot here. I'm going to go ahead and push the throttle all the way forward. The aircraft is going to pick up a little bit of speed, and I'm just going to keep this airspeed at exactly what it was a moment ago. You can see I'm picking up speed pretty quick there. So now we're going to start climbing, but the airspeed in the aircraft has not changed. Yes, this is a flight level change if we were in automatic pilot mode. Again, keep an eye on all of your instruments. Don't fixate on one of them. Let's say we're going to climb up just a little bit here. Again, since I'm keeping my speed constant, I have not touched my trim yet, which makes this much, much, much quicker and much, much easier on me. So again, so I can concentrate on other things. So the vertical speed looks pretty good. About 300 feet per minute is what I expected. Holding 110 knots, 2,200 feet. Drifting just slightly to the right. I'll go ahead and reduce it a little bit. Again, we're just trying to fly parallel to that line. Let's say we get to our cruise altitude. Now all we have to do is pull our power back and just hang on to the controls for just a moment as the aircraft will retrim itself. Again, now I don't have to touch the trim at all because I just used my throttle in order to control the up and down. So let's do the opposite. I'm going to go ahead and pull the throttle back a little bit. And again, I'm going to try to keep that speed as close to 110 as possible. If I've done everything correctly, I shouldn't even have to touch the controls. It is going to be a little on the slow side, however, because of the fact that it takes a little while for speed changes to actually be noticed. So you can see that that little reduction in power, again, I'll look down so you can see it, has caused us to get about 200 feet per minute descent. So if I decrease my power more, again, I'm not touching my trim here because I don't want to, you can see that that's going to increase my rate of descent without adjusting my speed. So during this entire descending process, I'm still going like this the entire time. Again, constantly. Again, you don't want to spend more than half a second on any given instrument. Now, when you do real instrument training, unfortunately, you're going to have to run into scenarios where instruments don't work. So you're going to have to figure out how to figure out what you're doing by looking at the other instruments. So I'm actually going to go ahead and pull my throttle out just a teeny tiny bit more, because I need to get a little bit more deceleration here. I need a little more descent, I should say. So again, you can see, again, I'm constantly checking my instruments. Vertical speed looks good. Again, I have not touched my trim, but my airspeed is staying the same. So if at any point I needed to level off, all I have to do is push my throttle back up to where it was a moment ago. Noticing I'm starting to get a little bit quick on the descent, so I'm just going to go ahead and apply a little bit of back pressure and increase my throttle by about, say, 100 RPM. And it should get me, again, close to about 500 feet per minute. You can see by the yoke that's sitting there that I'm basically not touching the controls here. The more you rail on those controls, the more work is going to be for your future. So I'm just going to continue my nice gentle descent here. Again, you want to be super duper duper ginger. One technique that I've learned that works really, really well when you're learning to fly by hand here is basically use your rudder to do tiny corrections versus using ailerons. So once you get the plane tilted, you're going to be changing the dynamics as far as lift goes. So I'm just, again, I can see that I've got a little bit too much vertical speed there. So I'm going to pull my throttle back basically a couple millimeters here in order to get me going down a little bit quicker. I can see that my airspeed's starting to get a little bit high there. Remember, we were supposed to be keeping around 110 based on our trim. So I've probably let it pick up. Again, as the air gets a little denser, your airspeed is going to slowly hike upwards also. All right, not touching anything, not touching anything. There we go, back down to 110 again. That's what I expected. We're starting to pick up a little bit of chop here, which doesn't surprise me. One thing that I had to learn in the early days is you can't dance with the wind. So if the wind really starts jerking you around, take the average, and that's about as close as anybody's going to get. You know, don't stress out. Even the autopilot can't figure that out when it gets that bad. All right, kind of slowing down here. You always want to be thinking about your minimums here. You know, if I accidentally dip under 1,000 feet, does that mean I'm going to crash into something? The good news is no. In this particular case, I won't crash into anything. And luckily for us, the airport that we were looking for is literally right there flashing happily at us. So despite our efforts here, we actually did a pretty good job. So for those of you looking to practice this technique, again, like I said, never get stuck on a single instrument. If you spend more than 2 seconds looking at one instrument, you're going to let the other ones kind of get away. The other thing you want to do is just practice trying to stay at one altitude in one direction just for long periods of time. Then start doing very, very gentle turns, then start doing climbs and descents, and then start doing climbs and descents with gentle turns. And you can see that everything gets very overwhelming very quickly. Again, little aircraft like this tend to be tremendously sensitive. The instruments in the real plane, by the way, are not nearly that touchy. You'll be actually kind of surprised by that. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring ourselves into a pretty standard traffic pattern, pop this thing down on the ground, and we're pretty much going to call it right there. So again, for quick review, again, remember that all the instruments you have, this one can be configured with this little knob. Don't forget to turn your lights on so you can actually see what your instruments are telling you. Use extremely gentle controls. Remember, trim is your best friend. You can probably hear me clicking away over there in the background trying to get that trim reset here. I know we're about to enter into kind of a funky shaped traffic pattern here that's going to get us back on the ground. People who operate aircraft that have the G1000, you have a drastically simpler time of this process because all your information is presented in a nice, easy to read digital format that is tremendously simple to use. All right, there's our runway 20. We're going to be spinning around. I'll bring the nose down just a little bit. Traffic pattern altitude is actually supposed to be 1,032 feet, but I don't think they're going to care too much with us. Yeah, I'm getting that nice chop there. Again, that's what makes flying fun. If we didn't have chop, there'd be nothing to do. Looking pretty good here. Go ahead and line ourselves up parallel. We're a little close to the runway, so we actually want to kind of make that turn extra wide as we kind of make our approach here. Gotta give myself just a little bit of room. It's only a mile long, so we're pretty darn close to it as is. All right, we're going to go ahead and start bringing ourselves this way. That nose up just a tiny bit. It looks pretty good. We're pretty parallel. Awesome. First notch of flaps comes down. Now, the interesting thing is that when you're concentrating extremely on flying in hand instrument conditions, you're always going to run into the problem where you forget to put things like flaps and gear. So it's really important that you have, either a checklist or somebody to kind of keep you honest, because that gets really nasty. All right, looks pretty good. Our runway 2, we are way too close to that runway, so that crosswind coming from the west is a lot stronger than I anticipated. It's all right. Beam it. We'll go ahead and drop the power. Get yourselves going to about 70 knots or so. Now, this is super easy in the real world because you've got this lake right here, and basically you just skirt the outside of the lake, and that lines you up really well for a landing. So at least that's convenient. And we're going for about 65 knots. Again, we're still a victim of that strangeness. That is that flaps bug that they created, where all the flaps create twice as much lift as they're supposed to. So I would not be surprised if this landing is not one of my best for sure. Looks pretty good. It's about 45 degrees. I'm up way too high. Go ahead and pop this thing down. A nice coordinated turn here. Don't forget to use your rudder pedals. It's called Wethersfield Cove, by the way, if you're curious. I'm going to turn out here so I can see the end of the runway. Hey, we are still way too high. All right, go ahead and take a nice gentle turn to kind of set us back up at the end of the runway here. Again, you can use Route 91, which is right down there. Makes your lives easier. Pop in that last notch of flaps. I'm going to kick the rudder over a little bit. Like I said, we're a little high still. Ooh, man, do we overshoot that. That was embarrassing. That's unacceptable. That's unacceptable. All right, let's go ahead and bring this thing down to the ground here. Of course, when you're doing everything by hand, which is a super duper fun challenge, you'll be in a situation where you'll have to do this entire concentration process until you basically see the end of the runway. So you can imagine just how much fun that really is. Whee! You'd think there'd be something broken with my rudder pedals with that last gust. Whoa! Good morning, wind. That is a 10-knot difference. That is wind shear right there. All right, I'm more than close enough to the ground, so go ahead and kill the power completely. Again, nice, neat crosswind there. Get to the big old number 2. Oh, yeah, they were not kidding. Ha ha, I'm like a helicopter. This is great. Ha ha. Yeah, that's not how that works, but that's all right. Of course, in the real plane, when you kill the power, it's like brrr, and stops flying. All right, hopefully you found this video helpful. Again, I'm trying to continue with all the different maneuvers that is. If you are going for your private pilot, at least in the U.S., you're going to have to be comfortable with. The instrument flying for me was always some of the most fun part, and it's really not as bad in the real plane as it is. Most of it becomes procedural and kind of cerebral, as I like to call it, versus being able to manually control everything. Other than that, enjoy.